Thank you all for joining us this evening. I see some new faces and I see some familiar faces. So welcome everybody and thank you for joining us. Our History Happy Hour is a monthly program that's brought to us through the generosity of Therrien Waddell Construction Group. So thank you so much, Jerry, for supporting this program for so many years. This is only the second time that we're doing the Happy Hour virtually. We're very open to feedback, so if you want to let us know how you enjoyed it or if you have ideas about how we can improve the virtual experience, we're very open to hear that. During these really difficult times, we've all been experiencing trauma as individuals, as a country, and the museum too, as an organization, has been experiencing challenges and grappling with the role that we play in a system that benefits some at the expense of others. The museum stands firmly with those who are fighting against racism, structural disadvantage, and systematic injustice that have oppressed Black people in the United States for hundreds of years. The United States was built on discriminatory practices that were codified in our legal system, beginning with the dehumanization of Native people, followed by enslaving Black people in bondage as property for the financial benefit of some and the expense of many. Sandy Springs stands on land that was once a plantation where Black people were enslaved. We recognize that the museum is the beneficiary of a historically unjust system, and we're committed to working towards dismantling systems that perpetuate racism and discrimination in order to build a just and equal society. Tonight's program is just the first of many programs that we'll be hosting that challenge this dominant narrative. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, who is Dr. Chris Bonner, who specializes in African American history and the 19th century United States. His first book, which is A New Republic, Black Protest and the Creation of American Citizenship, was released in February 2020. Dr. Bonner is at work on a project considering how enslaved people navigate commercial networks as they sought to purchase their freedom in the early 19th century. His work appears in print most recently in the collection New Perspectives on the Black Intellectual Tradition, and digitally at Muster, the blog of the Journal of the Civil War Era, and at Black Perspectives, the blog for African American Intellectual Historical Society. As assistant professor at the University of Maryland, Dr. Bonner teaches courses covering African American politics and culture, slavery and emancipation in the Atlantic world, and the transformations of the United States during the 19th century, and race and ethnicity in early America. Originally from Chesapeake, Virginia, Dr. Bonner earned his BA from Howard University and his PhD from Yale University. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Chris, and thank you so much for being our speaker this evening, Chris.
Thank you so much, Allison, and thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. I hope you're somewhere that's safe from the rain and the storm. And I really appreciate you taking the time to be here this evening. So I'm going to talk first I want to make sure that I can get my slides to work. So let's see. Allison says, host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Okay, I will say, can you do it now?
Yes.
Oh.
All right.
There we go. Looks good.
All right. So in the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to outline some of the big ideas that are driving my book. I'll tell a story about some of the forms of Black politics that I explore in the project, and then I'll offer some thoughts about how my scholarship connects with ideas about Black politics today. The title for this talk is Runaways or Citizens Claimed as Such. And I'll start with a question. What does citizenship mean to you? What do you think about when I say the term citizen? What does it mean to say that a person is a citizen? Typically, when I ask these questions, I get a wide range of answers. People might talk about specific rights citizenship confers. They might mention broader benefits of citizen status, access to the law or access to the physical territory claimed by a national government. They might talk about intangible things like belonging to a nation or to a community. It's important that there are so many different ways to approach this question. Citizenship remains contested ground. Today, at the same time that people are trying to claim particular rights as citizens, others are working to deny certain groups access to the benefits of citizenship. Oops, we're not there yet. It's also important that even when people don't agree on what exactly citizenship means, they tend to have strong ideas about it. People do seem to agree that citizenship is a significant marker of a person's legal identity. They agree that it offers tangible and intangible benefits. People generally agree that citizenship is a thing worth fighting for. None of these qualities of citizenship are new. Since the beginning of the United States, people have disagreed about the precise terms of citizenship, even when they agreed that it was a thing worth fighting for. My book tells a series of stories about Black Americans pushing their way into that fight in the early 19th century. I write about free Black people who made claims about what citizenship meant in hopes of changing the legal terms of their lives in the United States. In their words and actions, Black people made radical arguments about citizenship, and they did critical work to shape the nation's legal development, even while those in positions of power worked to deny them a voice in the lawmaking process. A little context about Black life in the early 19th century. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, several northern states took steps to gradually abolish slavery. New York's gradual abolition law, which you're looking at a piece of here, said that enslaved people who were born after July 4th, 1799 would be free once they reached age 25 for women and age 28 for men. These kinds of laws slowly created a free Black population in the northern states. But at the same time, lawmakers limited Black freedom in profound ways. The US Congress excluded Black men from the military, and many states followed suit by barring Black men from their militias. Ohio required free Black people to put up a $500 bond before they could settle in that state. New York allowed Black men to vote only if they owned $250 worth of real estate. And so this equates to about $10,000 in today's money. In the face of these restrictions, Black people turned to citizenship in pursuit of justice. The word citizen appeared 11 times in the original US Constitution. And so you can see here some of the uses of citizenship. One of the most significant of those uses is at the bottom here, highlighted. Citizenship protects an undefined set of privileges and immunities. The Constitution implied that citizenship could be an important factor in determining a person's legal life, but it didn't name the rights or the obligations of the status. And it also, really importantly, didn't say who could be a citizen or who couldn't. So this uncertainty was powerful for Black activists. No law said African Americans could not be citizens, so Black people insisted that they were, and they demanded legal protections under citizen status. Citizenship became a flexible and potent tool for Black activists. And when they claimed rights as citizens, they contributed to ongoing conversations about the relationships among individuals and governments in the United States. This is the process that I referred to in the book's title, Remaking the Republic. Black folks were doing work that could change the nation's legal structures. One of the first things that comes to mind for many people when they think about citizenship is the right to vote. And this was true for the folks that I write about. One group of Black activists said the right to vote was indispensable to the protection, prosperity, and happiness of the citizen. Suffrage was critical to Black people's political concerns. But Black politics was complex in the 19th century, as it is now. And folks had concerns far beyond formal political access. I'm going to tell a story about a man named William Dixon that offers another angle on Black politics. Dixon's story helps us look beyond the vote. It offers a fuller sense of the strategies and the objectives of African American politics in the early 19th century. William Dixon's name emerged in the historical record after he was arrested in New York City on a spring morning in 1837. Dixon had left his home on the Bowery, headed to work, when a stranger grabbed him and brought him to face a judge at City Hall. Arriving in the courtroom, the stranger made his claim. The Black man who called himself William Dixon was actually a fugitive slave named Jake. Allegedly, this man named Jake had run away from Baltimore doctor Walter Allender 5 years earlier in 1832. In court, the slave catcher, the man who had been hired to find a fugitive, referred to William Dixon as Allender's Jake, This was a man called Jake, who was the property of Allender. Authorities brought Dixon to a cell in the crumbling jail called Bridewell, and they held him there for a week. Then on the morning of April 12th, 2 sheriffs escorted him from Bridewell to City Hall for another hearing before Judge Richard Riker. Under New York law, a single judge could decide whether an alleged fugitive would remain free or be sent into bondage. Judge Riker had a reputation for being a friend to slave owners. He had frequently ruled in their favor and regularly allowed alleged fugitives to be taken to the South. Standing before Judge Riker, the accused man protested his arrest. He insisted that his name was William Dixon, and he said this: "It is hard, Your Honor. It is hard to be thus treated in this land of liberty. I am an innocent man. I'm a free man. It is hard to be torn from my family and thrust into prison like a dog. I demand justice of Your Honor." Riker called for a recess in the case to decide the man's fate. The sheriffs took Dixon by the arms to escort him back to his jail cell. New York City Hall stands today as it did on that April afternoon in the middle of an 8-acre park in Lower Manhattan. And so I have a few pictures, including this one from a research trip that I took there while I was in grad school. When I realized that City Hall now was the same building that it was in 1837, I went for a tour. And so it was really cool to be able to see these spaces. After the hearing on April 12th, the sheriffs prepared to lead Dixon across the park to Bridewell. Flanking the captive, they walked down a grand staircase toward the building's main entrance. But as they ushered Dixon toward the doors of City Hall, they would have looked through the large windows that lined the front of the building, and they would have seen a massive crowd waiting outside. During the hearing, more than 1,000 African Americans had gathered on City Hall Plaza. The sheriffs were apparently unconcerned, but as soon as they stepped outside, the crowd surged forward. Several people attacked the sheriffs with wooden clubs. A woman standing at the front of the crowd pulled a knife from under her dress and handed it to Dixon. At first, he wasn't sure what to do while these strangers fought for his freedom, but he overcame his shock and he ran west toward Broadway, then turned north to seek shelter in the busy city streets. The crowd continued to fight with the authorities. One official ran outside to support the sheriffs, but according to a source, a strapping Negro wench grabbed him in a chokehold, and a group of young Black men pretty well pummeled him and tore the coat completely off his back. Meanwhile, Dixon kept moving north along Broadway. A man on horseback tried to stop him, but Dixon's new escort, several Black men armed with clubs, protected the fleeing prisoner. When he reached Duane Street, just a few blocks from City Hall, Dixon opted to take cover, ducking into a coal cellar to wait out his pursuers. Dixon's freedom was short-lived. A few hours later, a witness tipped off authorities and they stormed into the cellar, seized him, and brought him back to Bridewell. And so what you're looking at is a reasonably contemporary map of Lower Manhattan here. The black dot is City Hall, the green dot is the location of Bridewell Prison, and the red dot is where Dixon stopped in the coal cellar and was eventually apprehended. The attempt to rescue William Dixon reflected an important thread in Black and anti-slavery politics of the period. The white abolitionist Henry Clark Wright was dismayed that alleged fugitives had to work harder to prove their cases than alleged slave owners did. Wright said, "Here's the difficulty in all cases of runaways or citizens claimed as such. The whole burden of proof is thrown on the colored man." One Black New Yorker argued that if the citizen of a free state was claimed as a slave, he or she should be entitled to a jury trial to determine their status. Vocal Black and white activists insisted that alleged fugitive slaves were citizens and that citizenship must protect free people from being sent into bondage. This rhetoric was intended to urge lawmakers to enact measures that would defend an individual's freedom. But the reality was that William Dixon was held captive by a legal system designed to preserve Black slavery. The US Constitution empowered slave owners to reclaim fugitives who fled to another state. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 said slave owners could cross state lines to pursue runaways, and theoretically, it also allowed them to arrest free Black Northerners who they accused of being fugitive slaves. The simple fact that enslaved people were so valuable meant that Black Northerners lived in a precarious freedom. They might be seized mistakenly by slave catchers or maliciously by kidnappers. Kidnapping endangered all Black Northerners, which helps to explain why so many people gathered on City Hall Plaza to try to rescue William Dixon. Black New Yorkers had a history of organizing to defend their freedom. In 1835, an interracial group of abolitionists established the New York Committee of Vigilance, or the NYCV. They called for new laws to protect free Black people, and at the same time, they aided known fugitives who had come north looking for safety. The NYCV called this work practical abolition. They were doing concrete things to fight slavery and to fight the dangerous implications of slavery, the danger slavery posed to free Black people. Samuel Cornish was a leader in the NYCV, and he was the editor of the Colored American, a newspaper that printed its first issue just a few weeks before William Dixon's arrest. So Cornish must have thought that this was pretty good timing or pretty fortuitous timing, because he ended up having a lot of dramatic events to cover in the first month or so that the paper was being published. Like others in the Vigilance Committee, Cornish said alleged fugitives should have the protection of a jury trial. But one of the most interesting things about his writing from this time is that Cornish was extremely critical of the violent attempt to liberate William Dixon. He said the crowd was nothing more than a multitude of illiterate people. From his perspective, they weren't acting in a calculated way in pursuit of progress. Instead, Cornish said, the crowd had become mere subjects of passion. There was some legitimacy to his concerns. There were NYCV lawyers leading Dixon's defense. Cornish's hope was that the lawyers could convince the judge to grant Dixon a jury trial, and that decision might set a precedent for other lawmakers to follow. Cornish had doubts that a mob rescuing Dixon would have the same legal potential. But beyond his concerns about political tactics, Cornish was outraged that African Americans had done something he felt was so uncivil. He said that, he was especially displeased that women had played prominent roles in the attempted rescue. He said those activist women had degraded themselves. And he added this: "We begged their husbands to keep them at home for the time to come and find some better occupation for them." Cornish addressed this message to the thoughtless part of our colored citizens. He promoted narrow ideas about who could do meaningful, productive Black political work. Really, he was promoting narrow ideas about what kind of political work was meaningful or productive. Black women were often denied the chance to make their voices heard in Black newspapers and in public meetings during the 19th century. Men like Cornish had restrictive ideas about gender. They thought political activity wasn't appropriate for women. And to me, this is one of the things that's so fascinating about this attempted rescue of William Dixon. This kind of politics offered a clear opportunity for Black women to express their ideas in public. I like thinking about the woman who stood at the front of the crowd during the rescue, the woman who reached under her dress and pulled out a knife to hand to William Dixon. She did that because she thought it would help secure his freedom. Maybe she relished this opportunity to step outside of what many thought was proper women's work. Or maybe she had done this several times before. Maybe she had long ago rejected Cornish's ideas about what kind of behavior was acceptable for Black women. It's tough to know this woman's activist history. We don't even know her name. But what we do know is important. She made the choice to take a critical role in Dixon's rescue, and none of the people in the crowd stood in her way. Black women carved out opportunities for themselves to make their voices heard, despite some people's efforts to silence them. This woman's actions reflect some of the important truths about this attempted rescue. African Americans believed Dixon deserved a fair hearing, and they were convinced that the legal structures that were in place would not provide it. The mob action was about defending Dixon's freedom, but it was also about more than any single Black person. Attacking sheriffs and judges in order to liberate an alleged fugitive was a protest against the legal structures that imperiled all Black people's freedom. It was a protest against all sorts of legal proceedings that took place inside of New York's City Hall. Breaking the law was a critical form of Black politics. Through their actions, the crowd outside of City Hall added their voices to those that were calling for a different legal order in the United States. They added their voices to those that were calling for a legal order that would protect Black freedom as robustly as it defended slave owners' property rights. Breaking laws was one way Black activists highlighted injustice and demanded legal protections as citizens. And so despite what Samuel Cornish wrote, these folks were far from thoughtless. This is one way my work aligns with some of the issues that have been in the news the past few weeks. People across the country have gathered to protest police brutality, motivated in part by a video that shows the killing of George Floyd, a video that shows George Floyd being killed by Minnesota police officers. Some of these protests have involved various forms of violence, and many vocal figures, including President Obama, have criticized protesters who don't fit with their ideas about acceptable forms of Black politics. Obama, as you can see here, said of the protesters, "We should condemn the few who resort to violence." We saw arguments like this about Black protest strategies after uprisings in Baltimore and Ferguson in 2014 and 2015. Again, in those cases, police officers killed unarmed Black people, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Michael Brown in Ferguson. And Black people took to the streets to denounce long-standing, unchecked police brutality. At the time, many observers condemned these movements as violent, destructive, unruly, or unproductive. We can see a couple of examples of this in the Washington Post. So from April 2015, you can see here, peaceful protest shifts focus back to the death of Freddie Gray. And this is implying, of course, that violence wasn't expressing outrage about Freddie Gray's killing. We can also see this in this headline for this column, which begins with the premise, "Rioting makes no sense." But the violence we saw in 2014 and 2015, the violence we've seen in the past few weeks is only senseless to people who don't try to make sense of it. Violent forms of protest often reflect protesters' political thought. My sense is that right now, people have been more open to thinking critically about violence and protests than they were in 2015. Just in what I've been seeing and reading online, I see people invoking Martin Luther King Jr.'s statement that a riot is the language of the unheard, almost as often as I see people using King to discourage any and all kinds of violence. But still, vocal, prominent figures issue blanket condemnations of violence in politics. I see at least two problems with this kind of statement. First, this criticism obscures the fact that much of the violence we've seen in recent weeks is sparked by police who are violently suppressing protests, and protesters in response trying to defend themselves against militarized police forces. Second, I worry that this kind of criticism arms the enemies of change. When people set fire to police stations or cop cars, it's clear that they are expressing rage about a system that allows officers to kill Black people with impunity. Violent protest doesn't draw attention away from political concerns, but the criticism of violent protest can. And to me, people who insist on denouncing certain forms of Black protest sound a bit like conservative commentators who try to limit Black politics to the avenues that they feel are acceptable. If we're interested in advancing racial justice, rather than criticizing particular forms of protest, we should continue trying to understand the concerns underlying violent, law-breaking protests. The project of racial justice is better served by amplifying the reasons for Black rage, rather than condemning its results. This is the kind of work I try to do in my scholarship, asking questions about why people turn to violence in the effort to rescue William Dixon. If we can see political thought and expression here, in the sight of the violent, unruly attempt to rescue William Dixon, We should try to do the same for violent, unruly forms of contemporary Black politics. Violence might be protests. Law-breaking can be politics. We should ask thoughtful questions about the roots of particular political forms. Why might Black Americans choose certain avenues of political expression? What forms of Black thought are represented in collective public acts of lawbreaking? Making sense of these political acts can lead us to see the truth that certain legal structures need to be broken in order to bring people closer to justice. Turning back to Dixon's story. In the days after the failed rescue attempt, William Dixon's trial continued. His counsel called a number of witnesses, including a white ship captain who testified that he had employed Dixon occasionally since 1831, and a Black barber from Philadelphia who said he had known Dixon as a free man for 15 years. Walter Allender, Dixon's alleged owner, had to prove a difficult case. The slave called Jake had allegedly run away in 1832, so none of his witnesses could claim to have seen the man for at least 5 years. And then they had to prove that after all that time, they could identify one out of the 20,000 free and enslaved African Americans who lived in Baltimore. Judge Riker refused to deliver a prompt decision. He left Dixon to sit in a cell for 3 months. Perhaps he spent that time anxious that whatever decision he made might lead to more violence on the steps. Finally, in July 1837, Dixon's lawyers secured a writ that allowed Dixon to go free on bail. Under the terms of that writ, Dixon would have to return to court if the judge called him, but in any subsequent hearing, a jury would determine his fate. So this writ allowed Dixon to return to his life in New York, and it offered an important new layer of legal protection against enslavement. It seemed that Samuel Cornish and William Dixon and the NYCV lawyers had been right to obey the law in seeking protections for Black freedom. Judge Riker responded favorably to their arguments, and the case could set a valuable precedent for protecting other alleged fugitives in the time to come. In Dixon's story, we can see how people who were denied formal political rights were able to insert their voices and ideas into the spaces where laws were being made. In one sense, my book is all about stories like this. Free African Americans insisting that they should have a role in the lawmaking process and finding creative ways to push their way in. In New York, Black people learned the law and they risked their lives in defense of one another. These were two of the many ways they made themselves heard. Most of the Black folks in the crowd that rescued William Dixon wouldn't have been able to vote, so they figured out another way to express their concerns. Before I wrap up, there's a little epilogue to Dixon's story that I'd like to share. It offers another angle on the ways Black people pursued justice in this period. After he was released from jail, Dixon lived in a state of anxiety. He could still be called back to court, or he might be arrested again. He might even be kidnapped. His daily life was a tense experience. And perhaps no single encounter was more frightening than a chance meeting with a runaway slave from Maryland. In his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, Frederick Douglass described the morning he arrived in New York City in 1839, disembarking from a train just after he escaped slavery in Baltimore. Douglass was lost and lonely, wandering the streets of Lower Manhattan, and he felt overjoyed when he bumped into a Black man he remembered from Baltimore, a man he recognized as Allender's Jake. I knew Jake well, Douglass wrote. He had heard that Dr. Allender had sent slave catchers after the runaway, but Douglass was glad to see that Jake seemed to be thriving in freedom. As you might imagine, Jake was less than pleased to run into this old friend. He announced to Douglass, "I am William Dixon in New York," and he quickly walked away, leaving the more recent runaway alone in an unfamiliar city. Given what Douglass wrote about this encounter, it's worth considering a few more questions about William Dixon's story. Who knew the truth of Allender's Jake? Who knew that this man was a runaway? The Black New Yorkers who tried to rescue him understood how difficult it was for any African American to secure freedom through the law. Regardless of whether they knew Dixon was Jake, they did know that there were limits to the justice available to him, and they took steps to challenge that legal reality. Did the NYCV lawyers know that they were defending a fugitive? If so, then Dixon and his defense team broke the law repeatedly, brazenly, from inside of New York City Hall. Their lawbreaking helped move toward a precedent that might create new legal protections for Black freedom. The lawyers recruited witnesses, Black and white, who were willing to lie in court in an effort to protect African Americans. For all his condemnation of the attempted rescue, it seems likely that Samuel Cornish, who was a leader in the Vigilance Committee, also knew the truth about Dixon. This may be why he was so angry about the City Hall mob. Perhaps because he knew how much work had been done in court, how much work had been done to create this figure, William Dixon. He was exasperated that the public protest might disrupt this case that had taken so much labor and that carried so much potential. The legal case of the runaway slave Jake appears to have involved a series of acts of lawbreaking that took place both in and outside of City Hall. Finally, why did this man lie so ardently about his freedom? And why did he seem to think this would work? Maybe this was a simple choice for a person who was desperate to be free. William Dixon was a character, a performance of freedom enacted in the courtroom and on the streets. It was a skillful performance, a high-wire act of lawbreaking. His story shows us how well Black people understood the law. It shows us how effectively they manipulated and moved through legal structures, making transformative claims about citizenship, rights, and justice. William Dixon thought this would work because he was able to learn the law and to use the law. In the 1830s, African Americans deftly navigated the legal landscape of New York, working in print, in court, and in the streets to transform a fugitive slave called Allender's Jake into a free man named William Dixon. All right. So thank you for again for joining and taking part in this event. I think that I'm here to take some questions now. If you guys would like to offer in, I turned off my screen.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, so we're asking that people put their questions in the chat box. So I will read to you the first comment that was made, which is you can comment on the comment. I think a distinction should be made between people who are looting in an opportunistic way and people who are actually violently protesting. One could argue that the Black Panther Party is the ultimate example about how fighting violence with violence doesn't work against an enemy that has vastly more power than you do.
So there are a couple ways to go with that. Sure, I think that as time progresses, we as sort of thoughtful observers of what's going on in the world and maybe as historians, we should work to distinguish between the kinds of violence that we're seeing in the streets. And this includes distinguishing between violence that's perpetrated by police officers as opposed to violence that's organized and perpetrated by protesters as opposed to people who are running into stores and looting. My concern is that right now, that kind of distinction draws attention away from the reasons why people are violently destroying things. Whether they're doing it because they just want to steal, or they're doing it because they want to burn down a police station or a court where injustice is happening continuously. I think that if we're invested in the project of securing racial equality, we're just not really well served by drawing that kind of distinction, because that's what the people who are opposed to building racial equality want to emphasize. Critics of Black Lives Matter as a philosophy and as a movement want to highlight violence and destruction. And so even if we feel like those things are less than ideal, I guess my broadest thought is like, I don't know what we gain really by emphasizing that. So I think that's kind of the direction I'm going. I think that it's like, violence isn't good. Like, people should be able to live and be happy and be safe and comfortable, right? So I don't really know what we gain through the condemnation, like President Obama's blanket statement that people who adopt violent practices should be condemned. So I think that's broadly what I would say. I think the point about the Black Panthers, I think the Black Panther analogy is actually really compelling, and so I think the idea is that they are an example of the limitations of violence when an activist group is rivaled with a massively powerful militarized nation, right? Mm-hmm. By the same token, I think the Black Panther Party and the limitations of their political work is also an example of what happens when a group that is doing a lot of things, a movement that is doing a lot of things, is reduced to images of that group as violent, right? The famous images of the Black Panthers are Huey Newton with two guns sitting on a wicker chair and dozens of Black men armed with rifles walking into the California State House, right? Less famous images of the Black Panther Party, of course, are Black men and women giving out breakfast to poor kids in Baltimore and Oakland, right? And so I think that the point that I'm making is like the Black Panther Party was about so much more than violence, broadly defined. And I think that narratives, in part narratives that were constructed and encouraged by the government that was trying to suppress the Black Panther Party, have limited public awareness of how much work the Black Panther Party was doing.
Yeah.
But thank you. Yeah. I appreciate it. I'm a historian. Like, I don't have all the answers about contemporary politics. I'm just a person who is thinking about some of these things.
Yeah. Well, we're going to give you an easy question now. Did free Black men have the right to vote in New York at that time?
So Black men who owned more than $250 worth of property and who could show some sort of verification of that fact, they were able to vote. And this is, so Black voting in general across the North is sort of legislated on a state-by-state basis. So New York implements this property qualification in 1821, and it actually kind of reflects a lot of the earlier 19th century laws that restricted white men's voting rights. There was this belief around the time of the Revolution that people who didn't own property wouldn't be fully invested in like caring for their community, and so they shouldn't be able to vote because they weren't really like a part of a community. But those restrictions were sort of eliminated in the 18 teens and 20s on a state level, but at the same time you see these kinds of laws being created in northern states. Most states actually didn't have a property qualification. So Massachusetts and Maine allowed Black men to vote. Pennsylvania, after 1838, just said no Black man can vote. So I think the property qualification is, I don't want to say totally unique, but was not the most common way of legislating Black suffrage. So some Black men could vote in New York.
Mm-hmm. Did the Obama presidency have any effect on the way Black people pursue justice now?
So if anything, I actually think that, and I don't want to sound like I think like Barack Obama didn't do anything and he was not a good president and he's like a jerk for criticizing protest strategies, right? I do think though that some of the limitations of change that Obama's election and Obama's presidency produced, that has encouraged people to seek alternative forms of political activity, right? I think that in 2008 there was a flourishing of, to take his term, hope in the power of the electoral process, and immediately I think the Republicans in Congress were saying that their chief task was to make him a one-term president, to obstruct everything he tried to do. And so I don't think that the limitations of change in Obama's presidency were his fault. I think that they have led people to think about alternatives to the electoral process, and to think about how important not just the presidency is, but local elections and like the people who are actually in power over so much of our day-to-day lives. But I think that looking at those 8 years is a story of, I don't know how potent obstructionism can be as a government strategy, how much work was done and how much work continues to be done, not only to prevent Obama from implementing policies, but now to sort of dismantle his legacy. I think that there are really significant ways in which the government, as it's structured and as the parties currently operate, there are limits in terms of how much change can be implemented because of the sort of ideologies and the intense desire to obstruct any sort of change that I think characterizes the Republican Party.
Yeah. Somebody asked if you thought the protest today would be any different if Obama had not been president.
People would be angrier. I don't really know. That's an interesting question. I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, so much of, alongside the Mitch McConnell's feeling that his task was to make Obama a one-term president, I think that a lot of the racial resentment that Donald Trump rode into the White House was a response to Obama's presidency. And again, this is not something at all that's Obama's fault. But I think in a lot of ways, Donald Trump wouldn't have been president if Barack Obama hadn't been president. And it's just really, it's like,
wow,
it's really depressing to think, like to get something good, this is what you have to get afterward. But I think that's how outraged so many people were about an African-American president, a Black first family.
That's amazing. Somebody asked, are there any strategies created from Black-led organizations like the New York Committee of Vigilance that would be helpful for the Black Lives Matter activists to use today?
I want to say that generally there are a lot of resonances between contemporary, I guess, left politics and the politics that I'm talking about today, and the politics that I write about in my book. I mean, one of the foundations of Black political organizing in the 19th century was the practice of mutual aid. And I think originally this was like burial societies. Like people would chip in and pay dues, and then if someone died and needed to pay for a funeral, they would be able to take out from that account. And then that expanded to if people are working class folks and somebody's out of a job, or somebody gets injured, or somebody has a child and they need a little help to care for them, they were able to draw on those funds after having invested in this sort of, it's almost like a club, really, right? And I think that I actually just read a thing in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago about mutual aid practices that are developing in Brooklyn, chiefly around like taking care of folks who are struggling and unable to get out of the house because of COVID and their health concerns, right? So I think that there are a lot of ways in which the foundation of Black politics in the 19th century was like looking out for one another. Even somebody like Samuel Cornish, who was like really nasty, like a real jerk in terms of his criticisms of the City Hall mob, I do think that part of why he was doing that, as awful and sexist as what he was saying was, I think that part of why he was doing that was because he was really, really concerned about trying to implement legal change that would protect Black people, right? His concern was looking out for Black folks, looking out for other folks in need. And I think that kind of collective mindset is characteristic of a lot of what you see in Black Lives Matter protests. And I think it's characteristic of a lot of some of what I think are the most potent or significant political forms that are emerging today, or that are continuing to be practiced today.
Mm-hmm. Somebody asked about how racial equity in the United States compares to other nations, but I'm curious historically, were there large Black populations in European countries, and how were they treated historically?
In Europe, historically, not so much. I think that a lot of so my broad sense of this is that a lot of the diversification in Europe is a product of 20th century colonialism, whether it's colonialism in West Africa or into the West Indies as well. So I think that that's a lot of it's a very different history, and a history that I'm not super familiar with. But I do think that there are, one of the things that I think a lot of people are reading or thinking about now is Frantz Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth, which is about really the struggles of colonialism and the emergence of the rage, the anger that characterized anti-colonialism in 20th century West Africa. And people are thinking about that book as a way to think about African Americans, the challenges that African Americans are facing today. And I think that what that tells us is that a lot of even if the chronology is different, even if the actual structures of racial exclusion are different, a lot of the ideas are foundationally the same. Racial prejudice leads people to believe that certain groups are not entitled to the same benefits as others, and to try to build structures that are designed to implement that idea. The response to that is to sort of organize collectively and figure out ways to challenge and confront and really to dismantle those exclusionary structures. And so I think that there are some really broad similarities, but like context and the specificity of a space is really, really important for sort of understanding how racial exclusion and racism has developed and been practiced across space and time.
Yeah. Somebody asked a question about source materials. I sent you showed that example of the Black newspaper that was contemporary. Mm-hmm. What about primary source materials?
Yeah, so the newspapers from 1837. That's so a lot of what I use in my book are Black newspapers, and that was it was a really important form for Black politics. And I think one of the things that I write about in the book is that it was an important thing for Black politics because it was an important form for politics generally in the U.S. And one of the things that African Americans were trying to do in this period was to assert the fact that they were entitled to the same sort of benefits of life in the U.S. that white Americans were. And one of the ways they did that was to say, look, we can do all the same things that you do. And they were convinced that, like writing in a newspaper, sharing information, making arguments, that was a valuable way to try to produce change, right? So Black folks became invested in this idea that a newspaper was an important political form. So the first Black newspaper is Freedom's Journal. It's published in 1827. And actually, Samuel Cornish was a co-editor of that paper. And then there are several others established, a lot of them in New York, but across the North and the South in that period. So I use Black newspapers. I use abolitionist newspapers like The Liberator. One of the other main things that I use that's really interesting are the records of what were called the colored conventions or the Black conventions. And so these were basically like state and national meetings, gatherings of Black folks, typically men from across a broad geography, who would come together and talk about issues. And a lot of times they're sort of just like, I don't know, like places for Black men to argue with each other and to sort of like show off and act like they know better than everyone else. I've said to some people that sometimes they seem a little bit like particularly contentious condo board meetings or something. Like I can imagine that these are folks who are just like tired of seeing each other and ready to fight over anything. But one of the big things that they did, they would issue this like a list of resolutions where they would talk about what they thought were the most critical challenges they faced, and then talk about particular strategies that should be pursued. And so one of the things that you'll see is like, we recommend the establishment of a national newspaper that would reflect the interests of Black people across the country. We recommend petitioning to your lawmakers to secure the right of equal suffrage. And so they're not just places to argue, they're places for people to argue over strategy and then to really kind of try to implement those strategies. And so those records, there's a really great digital project called the Colored Conventions. I think it's called the Colored Conventions Project. If you Google it, you'll find it. And basically there are dozens of these records. If you ever just feel like looking at some 19th century Black political stuff, dozens of these records are available online for free. And you can really get a sense of so many things, like what were people's pressing concerns, how those concerns shifted, how people sort of put on the and really practice the forms of 19th century Black politics and rhetoric, and how they tried to not only talk with one another, but to reach out to a broader public. So those are probably two of the biggest bodies of sources that I
okay. Somebody shared the link to that in the chat box if anybody's interested. Somebody asked how you're working with the education system to get, well, I realize you work with the education system, to get more of your work into the classroom. I'm astonished by how few white people had never heard of Juneteenth until 2020.
Yeah. That I haven't been able to yet. Partly I haven't really looked into that opportunity, but I actually got an email. I don't think that this is gonna spoil anything. I got an email recently from someone who from a press that's producing a new textbook for Maryland, and they asked me to consult, not to write, but to sort of review it. And so I think, I hope that that's the kind of thing that will help. I'll see, like, you should probably say something about Juneteenth, or you should probably say something about the domestic slave trade, or whatever it might be, that hopefully I can, do that. So that's the kind of, that's the, if you know somebody, let me know. I think a lot. I love teaching in a university. I love talking with college students and grad students. I think a lot about how much more we as people could be doing to enhance people's awareness, young people's awareness of African American history.
Well, that's a wonderful place to end. I'm really happy to hear that. And Dr. Bonner is also a consultant on our historically Black communities project in Sandy Spring that we've been working on, which is how he and I met. Thank you so much. This was such an interesting talk, and we really appreciate your being here.